Greetings, everyone. This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. I'm here today to provide you some lectures about philosophy in the early Middle Ages. This is part of a course about the philosophical underpinnings of theological thought. So we have been in this course examining such things as the philosophical developments in the ancient schools of Plato and Aristotle, the development in the Old Academy, Middle Academy, and in Neoplatonism. And now we're going to look at a couple philosophers, 2 or 3 philosophers here in the early period of the Middle Ages before we reach the so-called, shall we say, High Middle Ages. All right. The name of this first lecture is Philosophy in the Early Middle Ages, Lecture 1. That's the name of the lecture, Lecture 1. And the first thing I want to say about the Middle Ages is what are the Middle Ages? When was it? Actually, the term Middle Ages wasn't used until the 15th century, I believe. And it was used rather as a term that would understand that something happened between ancient classical thought, classical humanism, and the Renaissance. And what was that? Well, that was the Middle Ages. Many of those years were dark, you see, they thought. And, of course, the Dark Ages, people in the Dark Ages didn't think that they were Dark Ages. They didn't say, I'm living in the Dark Ages. This is the result of prejudice of one time upon another. So anyway, the Middle Ages, a term that came to be used in the 15th century for the first time, probably. When was it? Well, some people say, well, the Middle Ages goes anywhere from the 2nd century up to the 15th. That seems a rather long time for the Middle Ages to be happening. Some would say, well, no, Middle Ages, we have to talk about the time beginning with, let's say, Anselm. This lecture will not get into trying to decide when the Middle Ages began or ended, who to include, but we'll just give a general overview of a couple philosophical thinkers, actually more than that, of course, that had influence upon theology. So anyway, we know that in the ancient world, they dealt with a series of questions, of course, and as the years went by and Christianity began, another series of questions came to the fore. Remember with Aristotle, we talked about the aporia, the puzzlement that we have when we are dealing with experience. Well, you can imagine the puzzlement that theologians had when they believed that they had acquired some kind of super-sensible truth, right? How did that super-sensible truth about God and God's relationship to the world, God's incarnation in Jesus of Nazareth, how did those supernatural, super-sensible truths, how do they relate to our other experience? That would produce puzzlement, and it did. So, what comprises medieval philosophy? Where did it come from? Well, classical Greek philosophy, of course, is very important in the development of medieval philosophy. That's the ground on which it developed. The dawning Christian religion, you might remember that Jesus lived in the early part of the 1st century, right? That's why we call it the 1st century, by the way. And after that, of course, Christianity developed, and by the 2nd century, we were seeing, a great spreading of Christianity. I won't rehearse all of this, but of course, by the 4th century, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, I mean, that's a pretty meteoric rise, right? A stellar rise of a religion. And how then does one philosophize using the old conceptuality of Greek philosophy in a world in which certain truths are considered to be the case, right? The incarnation, the Trinity. How does one philosophize within that context? And also, it's not just Greek philosophy and the dawning Christian religion. We also have Jewish and Islamic philosophical traditions that are at work as well. Of course, All of this produced some tensions. We have, certainly with Plato, we understood that there was a possibility of a disembodied existence of the soul, right? And we saw this in the Platonic tradition in general. How does this immortality of the soul, this doctrine of the immortality of the soul, fit with the nascent Christian tradition, right? The nascent Christian tradition. Certainly, Christianity builds upon, right, ancient Hebraic thought, and we all know that a doctrine of the immortality of the soul wasn't present in ancient Hebraic thought. And we also know the importance of the resurrection, right, for Christian teaching and thinking. So the resurrection is, of course, always a bodily resurrection. So how does the doctrine of the immortality of the soul fit with this notion of the bodily resurrection, right? And I remember when I was a kid, I learned at my church that when I died, I either went to heaven or hell, right? Because I had an immortal soul. But then sometime after that, my body would join me. And I remember as a little kid saying, well, what do I need my body for? What am I going to do with that thing? I'm already in heaven. What am I going to do with my body? Why do I need that? And of course, for Plato, this would have made no sense, right? To have a body, because that's going to slow you down. Intellectually, you're better off without your body, because you're relating to supersensible truths. And of course, with Aristotle, it gets even more murky, because Aristotle, of course, had a view of a soul, like he talked about a nutritive soul, a locomotive soul, right? And he talked about a rational soul. But he never talked about an immortal soul, right? So the soul that Aristotle has and that he talks about is completely connected to the body, and it seems not to be capable of life outside the body. So now how does that fit in then with the Platonic soul and the Christian tradition? Okay. Another question is, how is the incarnation possible? Do we have the philosophical conceptuality to think God became man? What does that mean? And of course, all of the so-called controversies of the 3rd and 4th century deal with issues like this, and how is the Trinity possible? What is the nature of Christ? All of these questions arose, and of course they were questions that were worked out upon the soil of the Greek metaphysical tradition. We have to remember this. Okay. The texts, by the time of Boethius, who lived from 480 to 525, Greek was becoming a dead language. But of course, the great texts of antiquity were in Greek. Well, you know, Boethius translated a few, and there were some translations here or there. But it became increasingly problematic for people to read the text. The early Middle Ages had the first half of the Timaeus, up to 53c in the critical edition. Jerome wrote in the early 5th century that most had forgotten Plato. Plotinus's Enneads were unavailable. So, I mean, this was a time in which, you know, I mean, we didn't have photocopy machines. We couldn't send texts, PDF files. I mean, can you imagine what value a text would have had if you could have happened upon one, right? Aristotle's categories and the interpretatione were in circulation by the 12th century. But, of course, people really didn't know the rest of the Aristotelian corpus until Albertus Magnus and his school received the texts that were translated and transmitted through the Islamic tradition. And then, of course, when Aristotle reappeared in the West in the 12th century, this was a huge clash of intellectual traditions between the reigning Augustinian tradition and this new tradition of Aristotle. And of course, people who were Augustinians said, hey, this Aristotelian stuff really doesn't work. I mean, this guy doesn't hold to an immortal soul, right? He holds that there was never a time when the world was not, you know, so there wasn't a creatio ex nihilo. So how does all this happen? And yet, when we get, to Aquinas' great work, the Summa Theologica, we find in Aquinas, he doesn't even have to specify who Aristotle is. He just calls him the philosopher. Everybody knows who the philosopher is. So putting together this tradition with the Christian tradition became the great project of medieval philosophy. Medievals knew ancient philosophy basically through Tertullian, Boethius, and Cicero, and of course this was in Latin. It's also interesting to know that a Platonism without Plato, sine Plato, was dominant in the early Middle Ages. So it wasn't like people were all the time reading Plato. We go back to the big guys, right? I mean, if you ever think about history, just think about our decisions about how to understand history and how to understand the history of thought. Of course, we understand the history of thought from the standpoint of what we think is important. So all those dead ends that we now see in the history of thought, we see as dead ends, but of course at the time they were vibrant philosophical traditions. And of course the history of thought isn't over yet, so we don't know what the final history of thought will record as the most important intellectual movements in history. The major philosophers of this period are Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430, Boethius, 480 to 525, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, right, late 5th century, John Scotus Urgena, 800 to 877, an Irishman. Yes, he's from Ireland. Anselm, 1033 to 1109, and our good friend Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142. Right? All right. So the first person I want to talk about is Augustine. There is a beautiful rendition of Augustine from Sandro Botticelli. Augustine was a rhetorician by training, a rhetoric professor by profession. And he's a philosopher to the extent that he's a lover of wisdom. Of course, in the ancient world, to be a lover of wisdom could have applied to a theologian as much as a philosopher. And of course, this was the case with our good friend Augustine. Okay, in his very early work, Augustine was prone to materialistic positions. And then he discovered the Platonist tradition, Neoplatonism. And it made him able to think that there could be a category of non-physical substance. This opened up the world to him, right? Now, of course, I could talk a lot about Augustine and his psychology and how he's handling his concubine and his relationship with his mother and all of this. You can read that some other place. I'm not going to talk about any of those things today. We're not going to talk about Augustine's amorous past or lack of amorous future. Any of that stuff that people like to talk about, we're not going to talk about. We will say that Augustine conceived of God as being goodness and truth, and certainly he was moving in this direction right along with his understanding of the Neoplatonic tradition. And he thought that God unified everything below. And of course, every one of us remembers Plotinus and the One, and how the One goes out of itself, emanates right into nous, and that emanates into the world soul, that emanates into the world, into matter. So God is, the One is at the highest mark of this chain, this hierarchy, and it makes everything make sense, right? Early on, Augustine distinguishes the eternal, intelligible world from the vicissitudes and transitory nature of the sensible world. Well, you should all be thinking Plato, right? This is very much in the tradition of Plato. His ethics, which we might call eudaimonianism, right? A eudaimonianism is an ethics that has as a final end the acquisition of happiness. Of course, we can talk about happiness in different ways. Certainly, Augustine in the Neoplatonic school was not talking about happiness in the same way that Jeremy Bentham was. Jeremy Bentham, remember, died in 1832, right before the Great Reform Bill passed, but he was the early father of utilitarianism. And he had a hedonistic principle. His happiness was a hedonism, right? Which is pleasure. Augustine would not have gone there, nor did our good friend Aristotle, right? We know from Aristotle that happiness is a kind of a total human flourishing, having to do with the cultivation of the intellectual and the moral virtues. So, Augustine's ethics strives towards happiness, and this seems to happen through a participation in, or a contemplation of, or a taking hold of the intelligible world over and against the sensible world. And this taking hold of the intelligible world is a freeing from the vicissitudes and the transitory nature of the sensible world. And I'm sure many of you, when you have problems in life, want to just do geometric proofs and just sit in your study and contemplate the eternal truths of mathematics. If you're one of those kinds, you are a closet Neoplatonist. Yes, you are. It's time to admit it. Okay, good and evil. Augustine understands natural evil as a limitation of perspective. If the one is ultimately good and being and true, then from the standpoint of the highest perspective, everything that is how it should be in order for the greatest happiness, the greatest total flourishing of all that is to be, right? Unfortunately, we're down under, and, it looks bad for us when, Stella has a brain tumor. Stella thinks that's a bad thing, right? But she can't see it from the divine perspective, but that would be a natural evil. Of course, we like to make all natural evils moral nature evils, so we figured, Stella must have eaten something, and she could have avoided it. However, seeing all natural evil from the standpoint of the intelligible frees human beings to understand it as a part of divine providence. I encourage you, if you haven't read them, to go to your computer and read Epictetus, the great Stoic, first century Stoic slave. But it's beautiful. Epictetus is beautiful because he counsels us to, seek this higher wisdom. Stoicism figures nicely here, and what we have to do is we have to find that we have to bring our minds into conformity with what is by natural law and how things are through natural law. So in bringing our thinking into conformity with what is, we achieve happiness, right? No matter how bad it is. Well, this is something of the same here. If we can see all things as being done by God, and that God really does have providence, he cares, then it's easier to take on, it's easier to endure the vicissitudes and the loss of temporality. Temporality devours us, right? And this is wonderful stuff. Of course, Jonathan Edwards believed the same thing. He believed in a strong divine providence and understood, he and his wife understood that when she got sick and was going to die, that this was part of the divine providence. Either that or Jonathan Edwards did. Anyway, I can't quite remember the story. But the truth of the matter is that if you're a Calvinist, and of course if you're a Calvinist, it means you like Augustine a lot, at least classically, this notion of divine providence can be really soothing to our existential lives here. Okay, human moral evil, according to Augustine, is due to the human will turning away from God and attaching itself to lower sensible goods, right? Like money, power, sex, food. Just run down the 7 deadly sins, right? They're attachments to the lower goods, the sensible goods. The will pursuing lower goods is not an efficient cause. This is a nice play on words by Augustine, but a deficient cause, see? Because it turns away from its true fount of being, which is God, and it takes after the sensible things that we find in the world. Now, of course, behind all of this is Augustine trying not to be a Manichaean. He does not want to give to evil a separate ontological status, right? Evil does not exist like good. Evil is the absence of good for our good friend Augustine and for all Neoplatonics. Augustine did not follow Plotinus in understanding God as the one beyond all human predication. He didn't quite go that far. He saw God as closer to us than that. But he also did not follow Plotinus in understanding the world as an emanation of the one, at least as his thought develops, right? Because he saw God as more distant than that. So this is kind of an interesting thing over against Plotinus. He sees God as closer to us in one way, because he's personal, but more distant to us in another way, because he's separate from the being that he creates, creatio ex nihilo. Augustine emphasizes the volitional nature of God. When you hear the word volitional, you are hearing the term which means having to do with the will. Augustine's anthropology, human being, is a body-soul composite with the soul having the higher reality. Okay? Soul is created, immaterial, but yet mutable. And this is very important because he has a theory, at least early on, about how the soul can change. And of course, personal moral responsibility has everything to do with the soul's ability to change. Now, he considers 4 hypotheses of the soul's origin. Number 1, God sent the soul to administer to the body. That's the sent hypothesis. The soul kind of inhabits the body through its own choice. Oh, I'm going to go get that one. This is pre-existent stuff, pre-existent souls. Or all souls are propagated from Adam's soul. This is called the traducianist hypothesis. Or God creates a new soul for each body, the creationist hypothesis. Now, by 415, Augustine rejects the first 2 options, and he seems to be moving towards a traducianism. But his thought really isn't completely settled there. Okay? Augustine follows Aristotle in distinguishing a hierarchy of souls. Anything that lives has a soul. So plants have souls, nutritive. Animals that walk around and snakes have locomotive souls. And then, of course, we have the rational souls of human beings. He follows Plato and Stoicism in general, and holding the soul as immaterial and immortal. But, of course, scriptures advocate resurrection, not the immortality of the soul, right? As Tertullian says. Now, Tertullian seems to be, he's a great church father, somebody who did not hold to the immortality of the soul. And it seems, at least in certain places, he is suggesting that resurrection's our only hope, okay? Now, Augustine assumes the ascendancy of reason over the lower parts of the soul, and this is called an intellectualist position, okay? So he would be an advocate of intellectualism in that reason has more power than the lower parts of the soul. And his focus is eudaimonistic, how the soul can find happiness by overcoming the lower nature. He distinguishes things that exist and live, and things that exist, live, and understand. And of course, human beings are examples of the last. The objects of sense, as we've talked about, are mutable, material, and ultimately unreliable. It turns out that sense perception is always perspectival, right? So we see a tree, and of course it looks different from different angles. I can walk around this table, it looks like a different thing. Well, what is the unity of the thing apart from these different perspectival seeings? Well, he introduces a notion of an inner sense, which makes us aware that the senses flowing from our 5 senses, those images, those deliverances of our 5 senses, it helps us make coherent and bring us about a unity of those deliverances of the 5 senses. Now, the thing is, this inner sense human beings have, but so does my dog. My dog has this as well. Human beings are different than dogs in that they have something that's higher than the inner sense, and this is reason. But reason for Augustine and for all good philosophers of this period is connectable to something very specific, and that is the ability to move forward with logical deductive reasoning. And this logical deductive reasoning puts human beings in touch with the higher goods. Reason distinguishes us from other beings and puts us in touch with, finally, reliable things, right? Like triangles, isosceles triangles, right? And wonderful deductions, A, E, I, O propositions. Remember, we can convert and obvert and contrapose them, and I hope all of you have been doing this in the privacy of your rooms. He holds that we have a direct acquaintance with the external world, and language is an instrument that communicates this acquaintance. And if you've ever read the Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus from Wittgenstein, the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein's second work, the Philosophical Investigations, he starts with laying out the Augustinian notion of language, and language is a tool, right, that communicates thoughts, right? So he is a realist in the sense that we have an acquaintance with the external world, and he believes that knowledge of the sensible world is relatively unproblematic, even though it's perspectival, but that his real interest is in the supersensible world, right? That's what he's very interested in knowing, these mathematical truths, the truths of philosophy. And at this point, we come to his theory of divine illumination. And I will start with this theory next time. This lecture is done at this point. We'll pick up with his theory of divine illumination next time. Thank you very much.